As we start day two, guys, a few reminders. Please be checking that schedule so you know what's going on each day. As we start this online class, I'm trying to keep just one day ahead of you guys, so I don't overwhelm you with what's up there. Um, it does kind of follow what we normally do in class. For instance, yesterday, all you had to do was just listen to the lecture and the PowerPoint. It was only 13, 14 minutes, so it shouldn't have taken you that long. Now, the warm up questions for today are obviously to go with what we did yesterday as far as the notes and the lecture go. So, that is where you're going to find the information if you don't know the answers to the questions. Now, for today, and as we start to get into this, your warm up questions tomorrow will be based off what we do today. So if you want to open that document up and you be working on those as I go through this lecture, that would be a smart way to do it. The same thing with your political cartoons and documents. They're going to be based off of what you did the day before. And if you listen to these, just like in class, guys, I'm going to go over it. I'll tell you what the cartoons are. I'll tell you these are the ones you got to do in your documents, and give you as much information as possible to make it easy for you at home. And again, if you get stuck on something you're not sure, please just let me know. Send me an email, and I'll get right back to you and let you know what I can do. Now, as far as starting new stuff for today, we will be talking about post-World War I in America. There's going to be some good things and some bad things that are associated with this. Please keep in mind, at the end of the Roaring Twenties, which will be next week, is going to be the Great Depression. So this idea of the Roaring Twenties and everything going good will come to an end by Thursday when we get to the second part of this unit. Now, the last thing we talked about yesterday was the spread of communism throughout Europe, primarily in Europe and different parts of Asia as a result of World War I, in those countries being devastated, people not having jobs, and cities being destroyed. That same concern of communism spreading did make the way to the United States. Now, for the Red Scare, and this is where we got to say, guys, you got to remember the word red. The red is going to be associated with communism. So for the Red Scare in the United States, this is the fear that communism would spread to the United States. Eventually, it will be called the first Red Scare. So there will be a second Red Scare after World War II. That is the exact same thing with the fear of communism spreading to the United States, because it did go against our idea of capitalism. Now, if you look at the political cartoon to your left, the red iceberg, that is one of the primary documents that you'll be working on today or tomorrow whenever you choose to do it. The one thing you want to look at, with the red iceberg, you do see the Soviet Union flag on the red iceberg. They are the ones that will be credited with starting communism in Europe, or forcing it to spread to other places. When you look at the headstones with the names of countries on them, those are going to be the other countries that communism spread to in Europe and into Asia. All right, and the reason they made them headstones, this obviously shows you this is against the spread of communism, because they did make it to look like headstones, and to show those countries kind of died. So that shows you this is against the spread of communism. For the United States, with Uncle Sam sitting on the boat, the big difference for us was we're across the Atlantic Ocean. We're in a different hemisphere. So the fear was that communism would cross the Atlantic and spread to the United States. So with this political cartoon, guys, this one shouldn't be that bad. Again, so you got point of view. You know what it's talking about. You can see the iceberg is red. That's always going to mean communism. And we have the Soviet Union flag. As far as dealing with this fear of communism spreading to the United States, and it was a very real fear, the next thing we have is something called the Palmer Raids. This would be our anti-communist campaign in the United States. It was led by Mitchell Palmer. We could say he was the federal agent whose job was to find suspected communists and eliminate them, whether it be arrest them or deport them. All right, and one of the problems with this is, as far as communism is concerned, it is very difficult to tell if someone is communist. All right, it's the same thing saying Democrat or Republican. You can't tell just by looking at something. As far as the people that were targeted, people coming from Russia or anyone who had recently arrived in the United States from a communist country would be a target. All right, so the goal was to identify suspected communists, arrest them, and deport them. When you look at this next political cartoon, I try to make it as big as I could, guys. This will be your third and last political cartoon for your documents for the day. When you look at it, if you read it, when it says Merry Christmas and it's sent to Lenin in Russia, This goes along with the Palmer raids. This goes along with the Red Scare. So we've got Uncle Sam. He's writing a little message. He's sending it back to Lenin in Russia. And this would be the idea of the United States deporting suspected communists, which would be the Russians. All right. And again, that's when I say, as far as who's going to be targeted as being a suspected communist, it would be individuals coming from communist countries. And if we thought you were communist, just as a political cartoon depicts, we would send those people back. We would deport them. So as far as point of view, you can explain it different ways. You could say this is from an American point of view because we're deporting foreigners. You could say this is against the spread of communism. But just make sure you get the historical message as far as the United States deporting suspected foreigners. And this would go along with the historical issue of the Red Scare. This is just a picture of Palmer's house being attacked. Obviously, when you're running around accusing people of being something and deporting them, it does not make you the most popular person. So his house was attacked. For number 3, with our Red Scare, and we have the word nativism again. This is a word that you have heard of before. You've heard a few times between American History 1 and American History 2. The top definition, guys, with nativism is just you're anti-immigrant. So nativist feelings are when the United States is opposed to immigrants coming in. The last time that we talked about it dealt with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman's Agreement, where we saw nativism on the West Coast, and we started to greatly reduce the number of Asian immigrants allowed in the United States. Now, at that time, the reason why the United States showed nativism towards Chinese and Japanese is as a result of limited jobs. This time, when we see the word nativism, it's going to be directed towards communists. So that's why it goes with the Red Scare. An example of how nativism kind of created fears in the United States is going to be the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, which is number 4. In this particular instance, you have 2 Italian immigrants that were arrested and charged with robbery and committing murder. It was a very unfair trial because they came from Italy, and that was a communist country at the time. They were given a very unfair trial. As far as their death sentence was concerned, most of the evidence pointed to them being innocent, but when the jury looked at them and they saw they were from Italy, those nativist feelings kind of reflected how the United States was opposed to communism, and they did get the death sentence. For number 5, another reaction to the Red Scare seen in the United States is going to be a quota system in relation to immigration. The United States immigration policy, like the 2 examples I just gave you with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman's Agreement, is usually based on how many jobs are available in the United States and how our economy is doing. This time, the United States comes to what is known as a quota system, where we start to put a limit of immigrants from certain countries. So countries that are communist, we obviously put a very low quota. We did not want people from those countries. Whereas if you're coming from another country who is not communist, that quota or that set number would be much higher. And guys, the word quota is something that you should be relatively familiar with. Meeting your quota, when you go get a job, does pertain to a lot of professions. You could say if you're a used car salesman and you need to meet your quota, it's how many cars you have to sell. If you're a nurse and you have a quota of how many patients you need to see, that's that set number of patients that you should be treating in a certain day. So quota is a word that you should be familiar with. Another issue in the United States following the end of World War I is going to be our post-war industry. As we talked about in World War I, and I did mention it yesterday, World War I financially worked out fairly well for the United States. There was no war going on within our boundaries. Our factories were running as fast and hard as they could. And truth be told, the United States made a significant amount of money during World War I and shortly thereafter as a result of most countries being forced to buy products from the United States. Now, the problem is, at the end of the war, and as these European countries began to rebuild their own factories, they began to purchase less and less from the United States. So when it says, after World War I, demand for factory goods decreased, this was a problem. So the United States went from selling as much as they could make or as much as they could produce, and the problem then becomes when European countries start making their own products and buying less from the United States, that is going to slow our economy. And just as you know, if you own a big factory, if you start selling less goods, you need to start firing employees, and this is kind of starts the downward spiral for the United States economy. So at some point, the Roaring 20s or the wealth that was created or the economy that grew as a result of the war, it did begin to slow down by the mid to late 20s, and that will get us to our Great Depression. One of the groups that was hit probably the hardest and the fastest is going to be our farmers. All right, and one of the reasons is, if you think about it, in Europe, to restart your farming industry or to get farmers back on their feet growing food does not take as long as a factory, because you don't necessarily have to rebuild buildings with electricity and bring in machines. Um, the United States farmers during World War I, they had produced enough food for the soldiers, the people living in the United States, and in most circumstances, export food to support those European countries involved in the war. Now, as far as an issue that is seen very quickly is going to be overproduction. So these farmers that kept producing a large amount of food or growing as many crops as they could, they quickly realized, with the war being over and Europeans able to grow and produce their own food, that they way overproduce. And if you overproduce, we talked about this before with the Farmers Alliance and the Grange movement, when you overproduce, that drives down the price, and if the price is low, you're just going to keep losing money, which the end result is going to be the farmers losing their farms because they're unable to pay back the banks. Also, following the end of World War I, we start to see a rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This is something we talked about in American History 1 when the KKK was started, with that guy that we said where Forrest Gump gets his name from, Nedford Bedford Forrest. Um, with the KKK and the uprising, this is also just a result of laws not being enforced in the South. If you remember yesterday, we did look at an electoral college map for President Harding in 1920, and I said the country is still divided. Everyone pretty much in the North is going to vote for a Republican, and then all the southern states, going back to the Civil War, still voting for a Democrat. So it still just shows us there is racism, there is segregation, and as far as equality, those laws were not being enforced in the South. So we do see a rise of the KKK again in the South. For the word anarchist, this is another word that kind of pops up during this time period in the 20s. It goes along with communism. As far as anarchy or anarchists, these are people who believe there should be no government or laws. This kind of goes along. They began to be associated with labor strikes as far as not showing up to work. People that believe that everyone should be treated equally or the workers should own the factories. Again, kind of gets mixed in with the communist fear and the Red Scare of, should there be laws? Who should be in charge? Should everyone be equal, or should everyone get the same? Now, when we get into probably the more interesting part of the 1920s, while the farmers were not doing well very early on, most people during the 1920s financially were doing rather well. There's going to be some inventions. Just kind of looking at the pictures, guys, I think you might know some of the stuff, especially if you read the book or saw the movie The Great Gatsby. We're going to have the Jazz Age, which is going to be associated with the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to see a lot of innovations with technologies. Even the picture of the car, we'll talk about the idea of credit and being able to buy things and pay it back later. We'll talk about flappers, with women changing their role in society as well. Now, as far as the Roaring Twenties, which is also known as the Jazz Age, those are kind of the two nicknames for the 1920s. Most often, this is referred to when modern America is born. Now, when we say modern, this does mean inventions, but it also means a few other things. If you look to the bottom left at some of those pictures, and I think you guys might know some of them, when we say modern America, we're also talking about entertainment and celebrities. Again, looking down at the poster where it says Roaring Twenties, from left to right, that's going to be Babe Ruth, Duke Ellington, Al Capone, and Amelia Earhart. Those are some names that you've probably heard of before. And this is when the United States, when we say enters that modern age of entertainment and celebrities. As far as that urban society for number two, this is also when we see a majority of Americans that lived in cities, which we've always talked about. You live in a city, you get a paycheck, you're not growing your own food, you just go to a grocery store. And another thing that's going to change with these celebrities is, because the economy is doing so well, you also have enough money to go out and go to a professional baseball game or pay to go to a club and watch Duke Ellington play. So this is also a time period where people have enough money to do things outside of what they need just to survive. The word urbanization, I know it's kind of popped up over and over again with us, and you can start to see the cities Guys, you know the word urban, that means city, and urbanization means cities are getting bigger. That's kind of where this class started with Unit 1. As far as that urban society, again, just most people lived in the cities. And we also start to see the emergence of suburbs. And I try to like kind of pick that picture. When you live in a suburb, usually you work in a city, but you live outside the city. And what makes this possible, which everyone's starting to get, and we will talk more about it, is the automobile. So the idea is with the suburbs, which kind of pops up or becomes prominent in the 1920s, is you can work in the middle of a city in an office building, but you can also walk out and get in your car and drive 20 minutes away and walk into your house and be in a suburb if you don't want to live in an apartment. Another thing is associated with urbanization as far as these jobs in the cities, which again makes this more of a modern age, is the emphasis on education. To get these better middle class, higher paying jobs, this is also that turning point in the United States when education becomes extremely important for getting better jobs. Now, for number 4, another big change which contributed to a growing um, urban population is going to be what's known as the Great Migration. And this does go back to World War One. The Great Migration is when a large number of African Americans moved to the north, primarily to major cities, to take advantage of the booming economy associated with World War One. Again, this is one of those things where we're going to go all the way back to American history one at the end of the Civil War. Most former slaves, most African Americans were more or less trapped in the South. They became involved with tenant farming or sharecropping, and there was not an opportunity for a lot of African Americans to get out of the South. Now, just like today, usually when people move, one of the main reasons people move is to get a better job. So when World War II broke out and factories were looking for as many workers as possible, this was the perfect opportunity for a large number of African Americans to leave the South, leave segregation, leave a lot of the racism that was associated with it, and move to the North and get a better paying factory job. What changes is kind of the demographic in society in the North with a larger number of African Americans coming out of the South. And for those African Americans, one of the big differences was in the South, without segregation and not as much racism, their culture was more celebrated, which we'll talk about with the Harlem Renaissance. For Harlem, New York, that became pretty much the one of the largest cities or saw the greatest growth of a African American population. For the Harlem Renaissance, which I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of before, and again, I'm trying to show you some of the art and pictures to the left as far as what's associated with it. Um, I'm not going to make you guys remember the names as much, but I think you've heard them. So I'm trying to throw some names out there that you guys might have heard of before, you know about, to try to make a connection. The real basic definition of the Harlem Renaissance and the Jazz Age is going to be an African American art and culture movement. So I try to give you the art at the top. Anytime you see paintings, usually with kind of the darker purples, that's more of a Harlem Renaissance style of art. Now, just examples of different type of artists. We have Langston Hughes, which was a famous African American author who wrote some books. We have Betsy Smith, who was a famous African American dancer, worked at different clubs. And for our musicians, just picking a couple of the famous ones, I know there's a lot more, and you guys might know more than me, would be Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Again, just trying to show you some names you might be able to associate with this Harlem Renaissance. And again, this goes back to the Great Migration with more African Americans coming to the North, and that African American culture being celebrated in the South, in the North, whereas in the South, segregation, there wasn't as much freedom, while in the North, African American culture was celebrated and became known as the Harlem Renaissance. And again, guys, just some pictures and different names. And honestly, I'm just trying to show you as many different examples, things that you might have heard of before. We'll talk about the flappers. We got some of our writers and authors and our musicians. For authors, for number 6, don't think I'm going to make you remember every author. You need to know the author and the book and what it was about. More just want you to see the names and kind of know the names. Now, some of these you should have heard of. Sinclair Lewis would be the one that probably the least amount of you have heard of before. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He wrote books about small-time life. Now, for Scott Fitzgerald, that would be one that most of you that read The Great Gatsby would know, just because I know they read that book in 11th grade English class or English 3. So that would be one you're aware of. As far as Ernest Hemingway, you might have heard of him, A Farewell to Arms. He wrote about the glory of War One. So you don't really need to remember the names in the book and everything they did. Again, these are just examples of authors. And I try to pick a couple that I believe you have heard of before. Where we're going to finish up with post-World War I in the United States is going to be with Marcus Garvey. He is going to be one of our American civil rights leader. And just like earlier this year when we talked about Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, I always say these are important civil rights leaders. They just don't get as much recognition as Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. So just like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois from Unit 3, Marcus Garvey is another civil rights leader who had a different opinion on how to achieve equality for African Americans in the United States. He started what became known as the Back to Africa movement. And just like what it sounds like with the Back to Africa movement, he encouraged African Americans to move back to Africa. So his way of kind of combating or ending segregation and racism in the United States for African Americans was for African Americans to leave the United States, go back to Africa, and create different towns and cities in Africa where equality could be achieved. As far as the success of the Back to Africa movement, when it says few people left the United States, this was not a large movement or one that lasted, or obviously, most of you would have heard about it already. But it is important because it shows you there are steps for civil rights, and there were different opinions, guys. And again, I can't help but go back. When we talked about Booker T. Washington, he was our civil rights leader that said, segregation is going to exist for a while. We need to accept it. Financial independence is important. And that's why he went on to start schools. And then we talked about W.E. Du Bois, who felt that segregation needed to be ended today and equality needed to be achieved legally. So civil rights has been going on, obviously, since the Civil War, before the Civil War, and there are different opinions about it. Now, we are going to end with Marcus Garvey for the day. Again, if you go back, and I know you can fast forward and rewind, we've talked about the political cartoons. I did one yesterday and went over it. I did the other two today, so you shouldn't have any issues getting your political cartoons done. As far as your warm-up questions, guys, just like in class, the warm-up questions that say day 2, they're going to go with the day 1 notes and lecture. And the warm-up questions, which I will post for day 3, will go with what we went over today. So again, if you're having any issues, please email me and let me know.